The struggle for equality has always been more than a series of marches, speeches, or courtroom victories. It is the heartbeat of a people insisting that their humanity be recognized, their dignity respected, and their voices heard. The American Civil Rights Movement was not just a chapter in history, it was a reckoning, a moment when ordinary individuals dared to confront centuries of injustice and rewrite the meaning of freedom itself. Hello and welcome to the Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The civil rights movement in the United States is often remembered through powerful images. Martin Luther King Jr. at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Rosa Parks refusing to surrender her bus seat, children walking bravely into newly integrated schools while surrounded by angry mobs. But behind these iconic moments lies a deeper tapestry of struggle, resilience, and everyday courage. It was not simply the work of a few celebrated leaders. It was the collective action of countless individuals, known and unknown, who risked everything to demand equality in a nation that had promised liberty and justice for all, but had long denied it to many of its own citizens. To truly understand this movement, we must go back to the aftermath of the American Civil War. Slavery was abolished with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, and for a brief moment during Reconstruction, hope blossomed. Formerly enslaved African Americans voted, held political office, and began to build schools and communities. But that hope was violently suppressed by white supremacist backlash, Jim Crow laws, and systematic disenfranchisement. By the turn of the 20th century, segregation had become the law of the land in much of the South, and racial inequality was deeply entrenched across the nation. The civil rights movement, as we think of it today, was not born in the 1950s. It was the culmination of decades of resistance. African Americans had never accepted second-class citizenship passively. From Ida B. Wells's fearless anti-lynching crusade in the late 19th century to W.E.B. Du Bois and the founding of the NAACP in 1909 to A. Philip Randolph organizing black workers into unions, there had always been a steady undercurrent of resistance. What changed in the mid-20th century was momentum. A new generation shaped by 2 world wars, by migration to the cities, and by the promises of American democracy decided that waiting was no longer acceptable. World War II played a crucial role in this awakening. African American soldiers fought bravely overseas against fascism and tyranny, yet returned home to segregation and humiliation. The contradiction was glaring. How could America claim to be the leader of the free world while treating millions of its citizens as second class? This hypocrisy fueled what became known as the Double V campaign: victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism. Black newspapers and community leaders spread the message that the fight for democracy could not stop at foreign shores. In the years after the war, grassroots pressure grew stronger. The NAACP pursued a strategy of challenging segregation in the courts, with brilliant lawyers like Thurgood Marshall leading the charge. Meanwhile, communities organized boycotts, protests, and voter registration drives, often facing brutal violence in return. By the early 1950s, the nation stood on the edge of a profound transformation. One of the first major cracks in the wall of segregation came in 1954 with the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. The court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, declaring that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. It was a landmark victory, but one that was met with massive resistance in the South. Governors, school boards, and angry citizens vowed to defy the ruling. Integration would not come easily. The story of the Little Rock Nine in 1957 illustrates this resistance. 9 African American students attempted to attend the previously all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were met by mobs of white protesters and even the Arkansas National Guard, called in by the governor to prevent them from entering. It took the direct intervention of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who sent federal troops to escort the students for them to finally walk into the school. The images of young black teenagers braving insults and threats, guarded by soldiers with rifles, shocked the nation and the world. But education was only one battlefield. Public transportation became another flashpoint in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. When Rosa Parks, a quiet but determined seamstress, refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger, she sparked a movement that would capture national attention. The Montgomery bus boycott, led by a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr., lasted over a year. Black residents walked, carpooled, and endured enormous hardship rather than submit to segregation. Their victory, when the Supreme Court ruled bus segregation unconstitutional, proved that nonviolent mass protest could succeed. The Montgomery bus boycott also propelled King onto the national stage. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and rooted in Christian teachings, offered a powerful moral framework. It emphasized love, discipline, and dignity in the face of hatred and brutality. King's voice, his eloquence, and his courage resonated deeply with millions, both black and white. Yet the movement was never solely about one leader. Behind King were networks of churches, community organizers, women's groups, and students whose relentless efforts kept the momentum alive. In the early 1960s, sit-ins swept across the South. Beginning with 4 black college students at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, the sit-in movement spread like wildfire. Young people staged peaceful demonstrations by occupying whites-only spaces, cafeteria, libraries, parks, even swimming pools, refusing to leave until served or arrested. These actions inspired the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which became a vital force in mobilizing youth for the struggle. The Freedom Rides of 1961 escalated the challenge to segregation. Interracial groups of activists boarded buses traveling through the South, testing whether Supreme Court rulings outlying segregated bus terminals were being enforced. They were not. Riders were beaten, buses were firebombed, and mobs attacked them with the tacit approval of local police. Yet the brutality only drew greater media attention, forcing the federal government to intervene. The courage of the Freedom Riders demonstrated the power of direct action and exposed the deep ugliness of racial hatred to the entire nation. Meanwhile, the struggle for voting rights gained urgency. In many southern states, African Americans were systematically prevented from registering to vote through literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, and violence. Entire counties had virtually no black voters, despite large black populations. The right to vote was more than a constitutional guarantee. It was the key to political power and real change. Organizations like SNCC and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, launched voter registration drives, often at great personal risk. The early 1960s also saw the rise of fiery voices demanding faster change. Figures like Malcolm X, a minister in the Nation of Islam, rejected the slow pace of integration and called for black pride, self-defense, and independence. While often portrayed as a radical opposite to King, Malcolm X articulated the frustrations of many African Americans who were tired of waiting, tired of being patient, and tired of seeing promises broken. His message of black empowerment and dignity resonated in the urban North, where segregation was less about whites-only signs and more about housing discrimination, poverty, and police brutality. The movement reached a crescendo in 1963 with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Over 250,000 people gathered at the National Mall, making it one of the largest demonstrations in American history. It was here that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his immortal "I Have a Dream" speech, envisioning a nation where children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The march represented a broad coalition, not just civil rights groups, but labor unions, religious organizations, and ordinary citizens, demanding equality and economic justice. The Kennedy administration, facing both international pressure during the Cold War and domestic unrest, began to take stronger action on civil rights. After Kennedy's assassination in 1963, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, pushed forward landmark legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and education. It was a monumental step, though far from the end of the struggle. Voting rights remained a burning issue, and in 1965, Selma, Alabama became the epicenter. Peaceful marchers demanding the right to vote were brutally attacked by state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, an event known as Bloody Sunday. The images of men, women, and even children being beaten and tear-gassed shocked the conscience of the nation. Just days later, Martin Luther King Jr. led thousands of marchers from Selma to Montgomery, culminating in a rally at the state capitol. The courage of these marchers pushed President Johnson to call on Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act, which became law in August 1965, banning discriminatory practices that had disenfranchised. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968 was not just the silencing of a leader, it was the shattering of a dream still in motion. At just 39 years old, King had already altered the trajectory of American history. Yet his death revealed how fragile the progress remained. In Memphis, where he had gone to support striking sanitation workers, he was shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. News of his death spread like wildfire, igniting riots in more than 100 cities. Black communities across the nation were engulfed in grief, anger, and despair. For many, the hope of peaceful transformation seemed to have died with him. But the story of the civil rights movement did not end in 1968. To understand its full arc, we must look at both its achievements and its limitations, as well as the countless individuals who carried its torch forward long after the television cameras turned away. In the aftermath of King's death, many activists turned their attention to issues beyond formal segregation. Housing discrimination, economic inequality, and systemic poverty remained deeply entrenched, particularly in northern cities. The 1968 Fair Housing Act, passed just days after King's assassination, sought to outlaw racial discrimination in housing. But laws alone could not dismantle the centuries of inequality that had been woven into the fabric of American society. The struggle for fair housing, for jobs, for decent schools continued in ways that were often less visible but no less urgent. The late 1960s and 1970s also witnessed the growing influence of the Black Power movement. While mainstream America often feared or misunderstood the slogan Black Power, for many African Americans, it was an affirmation of pride, strength, and self-determination. It rejected the notion that Black people should measure themselves by white standards. Leaders like Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, called for a radical rethinking of strategy. Instead of pleading for acceptance into white institutions, Black communities should build their own political, economic, and cultural power. The Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, embodied this new militancy. The Panthers were known for their bold stance of armed self-defense against police brutality, patrolling neighborhoods with rifles and law books to monitor law enforcement. But beyond the militant image, the Panthers also created community programs, free breakfast for children, health clinics, and education initiatives that addressed the needs of people whom the government had long neglected. Their presence terrified the political establishment, leading to intense surveillance and repression by the FBI under its COINTELPRO program. Yet their impact reshaped the conversation about race, justice, and power in America. Meanwhile, legal and political gains continued, though often in hard-fought battles. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had dramatically increased Black voter registration in the South, but efforts to suppress the Black vote persisted. Redistricting battles, voter ID laws, and intimidation at the polls became new arenas for the fight. African Americans began to win elected office in greater numbers, transforming the political landscape of cities and states. By the 1970s, mayors of major cities like Cleveland, Los Angeles, and Atlanta were African American, a development that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. Cultural expressions of the movement also flourished. The rise of soul music, with artists like James Brown declaring "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud," and Nina Simone singing "Mississippi Goddamn," reflected the movement's emotional and cultural depths. Literature, theater, and poetry became vehicles for articulating both the pain of oppression and the pride of Black identity. This cultural renaissance was itself a form of resistance, asserting that African Americans would no longer be invisible or voiceless in the story of the nation. At the same time, the federal government responded with initiatives known as the War on Poverty and Great Society programs under President Johnson. These sought to address economic inequality through expanded social services, Medicare, Medicaid, and education funding. But the Vietnam War drained resources and attention, and many activists criticized the government for investing billions in war abroad while neglecting poverty and injustice at home. The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, another leader who had gained support in Black communities, further deepened the sense of lost opportunities. As the movement evolved, women played increasingly visible roles. While men like King, Malcolm X, and Carmichael often dominated headlines, women were the backbone of the struggle. Ella Baker, a strategist who emphasized grassroots organizing, helped guide SNCC and mentored countless young activists. Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper from Mississippi, electrified the nation with her testimony about being beaten for trying to register to vote. Her famous words, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired," captured the exhaustion and determination of millions. Women also organized boycotts, led local chapters, and sustained the daily work of resistance. Yet their contributions were often sidelined in a movement still shaped by patriarchal norms. By the 1970s, the civil rights movement had fractured into multiple streams. Some activists pursued electoral politics, believing that gaining positions of power was the surest path to change. Others emphasized economic development in Black communities, building cooperatives, credit unions, and independent institutions. Still others turned toward a broader struggle for social justice, connecting racial equality with issues of gender, class, and anti-imperialism. One of the legacies of the movement was the rise of affirmative action policies in education and employment. These programs sought to remedy the long history of exclusion by giving greater opportunities to historically marginalized groups. They sparked fierce debates, with opponents claiming they amounted to reverse discrimination. But supporters argued that they were necessary to level a playing field warped by centuries of systemic racism. The Supreme Court weighed in on these debates, most notably in the 1978 case Regents of the University of California v. Bakke, which upheld affirmative action but struck down the use of rigid racial quotas. The struggle also inspired other marginalized groups. The tactics of sit-ins, marches, and legal challenges were adopted by the women's movement, the Chicano movement, Native American activists, and the LGBTQ rights movement. The civil rights movement showed that grassroots organizing, moral appeal, and persistent pressure could challenge entrenched systems of power. Its influence rippled far beyond the African American community. Despite these advances, setbacks remained constant. School desegregation, for instance, faced continual resistance. In Boston in the mid-1970s, efforts to integrate schools through busing sparked violent protests, reminding the nation that racism was confined to the South. Economic inequality persisted, with Black unemployment rates often double those of whites. The war on drugs in the 1980s disproportionately targeted Black communities, leading to mass incarceration that many scholars and activists view a new form of racial control. The memory of the civil rights movement, however, continued to inspire new generations. Commemorations of Martin Luther King Day, first observed in 1986, became a national holiday, symbolizing the recognition of his moral leadership. Yet even as King was celebrated, many activists reminded the nation that his message had been radical, challenging not only racism, but poverty, militarism, and economic injustice. Sanitizing his legacy into a simple dream of colorblind harmony risked obscuring the harder truths he spoke. By the late 20th century, debates over the meaning of civil rights grew more complex.
Some argued that America had moved into a post-racial era, especially with the election of Barack Obama as the first African-American president in 2008. Others pointed to persistent disparities in wealth, education, healthcare, and criminal justice as evidence that the struggle was far from over. The deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many others in the 21st century reignited the urgency of the fight, leading to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. This modern movement, while distinct from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, drew from its legacy of protest, media attention, and grassroots organizing. Returning to the 1960s and 70s, it's important to see how the civil rights movement reshaped America's identity on the world stage. During the Cold War, Soviet propaganda frequently highlighted American racism to discredit U.S. claims of being the leader of the free world. The progress of civil rights legislation allowed the U.S. government to counter these criticisms, though often cynically. Still, the courage of African American activists resonated globally, inspiring movements against colonialism and apartheid. Nelson Mandela and South African freedom fighters drew strength from America's struggle, just as Gandhi's philosophy had earlier influenced King. The civil rights movement was not an isolated American story. It was part of a global wave of demands for dignity and justice. The movement also exposed the depths of resistance to change within the United States. White citizens' councils, the Ku Klux Klan, and countless local politicians fought tooth and nail to preserve segregation. Violence and intimidation were common, from church bombings to assassinations of activists like Medgar Evers. Yet every act of terror only underscored the righteousness of the movement's cause. When young people braved fire hoses in Birmingham, when marchers were beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, when freedom riders faced mobs with clubs, the stark contrast between brutality and nonviolent courage moved the conscience of millions watching on television. Television itself was a critical battlefield. The sight of dignified Black men and women in their Sunday best, peacefully marching while being attacked by police dogs and batons, pierced through the comfortable.
The American civil rights movement, at its heart, was a lesson in the complexity of social transformation. Laws could be changed, court decisions could be won, but the deeper struggle was always about the attitudes, prejudices, and fears that shaped human behavior. To see the full measure of its legacy, we must trace how the fight for equality unfolded in everyday life, in the quiet corners of towns and neighborhoods, as much as in the grand arenas of Washington politics. One of the underappreciated aspects of the movement was its attention to community building. While headlines focused on marches and speeches, the daily grind of activism often looked like registering voters, tutoring children, organizing carpools, or cooking meals for volunteers. In rural Mississippi, where SNCC sent college students to help with Freedom Summer in 1964, activists knocked on doors in tiny communities, urging residents to risk everything to sign their names on a voter registration card. Many of these efforts ended in intimidation, arrests, or worse, yet they laid the foundation for political change that would reverberate decades later. The sacrifices of those who participated in Freedom Summer illustrate the brutal costs of activism. 3 young men, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappeared in Mississippi during the campaign. Weeks later, their bodies were found buried in an earthen dam, murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan with the complicity of local law enforcement. Their deaths shocked the nation, but they also revealed a truth many African Americans had long known: the price of demanding democracy could be one's very life. The civil rights movement also taught the power of coalitions. African Americans did not march alone. Jewish Americans, liberal white Southerners, Catholic nuns, labor organizers, and even some politicians joined in, forming a patchwork of alliances. These coalitions were not always easy. Differences in strategy, priorities, and identity often caused tensions, but they were essential in demonstrating that the fight for equality was not merely a Black issue, but a test of America's democracy itself. The legal victories of the 1960s, Brown v. Board, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, are often celebrated as the movement's crowning achievements, yet the reality on the ground was uneven. In many schools, desegregation proceeded at a glacial pace. In some counties, years after Brown, no black child had entered a white classroom. White families fled public schools for private segregation academies, leaving public institutions underfunded and racially divided. In housing, the Fair Housing Act outlawed discrimination, but banks and real estate agents found subtle ways to continue redlining, denying loans and opportunities to black families. Progress was real, but so was the persistence of inequality. This tension between progress and resistance gave rise to a new generation of voices. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, young activists began to challenge not only the structures of racism, but also the strategies of the older generation. While Martin Luther King Jr. emphasized nonviolence and appeals to the moral conscience of America, others questioned whether this approach could achieve true liberation. Stokely Carmichael's call for Black Power represented this impatience. For many young people, Black Power was not about violence, but about agency, the right to define one's own identity, to celebrate African heritage, and to demand control over institutions that governed their lives. The Black Panther Party embodied these ideals in ways that captivated both supporters and critics. Their image, black berets, leather jackets, raised fists, became iconic. But behind the imagery was a vision of community survival. Panthers opened free medical clinics, provided food to schoolchildren, and published newspapers that educated readers about history, politics, and self-defense. They also organized against police brutality, a battle that remains strikingly relevant today. The federal government, alarmed by the Panthers' influence, targeted them relentlessly. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover labeled the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States, launching COINTELPRO operations that infiltrated, sabotaged, and dismantled the organization. At the same time, the civil rights struggle became intertwined with broader movements for social change. The Vietnam War intensified questions of justice. Many African American soldiers were drafted and sent to fight overseas, even as they were denied full citizenship rights at home. Martin Luther King Jr., in the last years of his life, spoke out forcefully against the war, calling it a moral catastrophe that drained resources from the fight against poverty. His 1967 speech, Beyond Vietnam, framed the struggle for civil rights as part of a larger battle against militarism, materialism, and global injustice. This stance cost him support among some allies, but it reflected his expanding vision of what true equality demanded. The women of the civil rights movement also began to demand recognition for their contributions. Ella Baker, whose insistence on grassroots leadership challenged the top-down style of male-dominated organizations. Diane Nash, who helped lead the freedom rides and voter registration drives, showed extraordinary courage and organizational skill. Septima Clark, known as the mother of the movement, pioneered citizenship schools that taught literacy and civic engagement to thousands of African Americans across the South. These women, often working behind the scenes, shaped the strategies and successes of the movement in ways that historians are only now beginning to fully appreciate. The legacy of the civil rights movement is also written in the realm of education. Historically Black colleges and universities became vital incubators of activism, producing leaders, teachers, and professionals who carried forward the struggle. Students who staged sit-ins and freedom rides often came from HBCUs, and these institutions provided a refuge where Black intellectual life could flourish despite segregation. Their role underscores how education and activism have always been intertwined in the pursuit of freedom. By the late 1970s, the nation had entered a new era. The triumphs of the 1960s had dismantled legal segregation, but deeper structural challenges remained. The rise of conservatism in American politics, symbolized by the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, shifted national priorities away from civil rights enforcement. Affirmative action came under attack, social welfare programs were cut, and mass incarceration policies accelerated. For many African Americans, the dream of equality still felt deferred. Yet the spirit of the civil rights movement never disappeared. In city councils, state legislatures, and Congress, African Americans began to exert political influence.
The Congressional Black Caucus, formed in 1971, became a voice for Black communities in national politics. Mayors like Maynard Jackson in Atlanta and Harold Washington in Chicago redefined urban governance. These achievements reflected the long-term fruits of voter registration drives and grassroots organizing decades earlier. The cultural impact of the movement also deepened. Literature by writers such as James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, and Toni Morrison captured the complexities of race, identity, and resilience. Films, plays, and television shows began to explore themes once ignored in mainstream culture. The idea that African Americans could tell their own stories rather than being portrayed through the lens of stereotypes was itself a victory of the movement. Internationally, the civil rights movement inspired liberation struggles in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Leaders fighting colonialism saw in America's Black activists a mirror of their own struggles. The chants of freedom in Alabama echoed in the streets of Soweto, in the fields of Angola, in the villages of Vietnam. The global resonance of the civil rights movement reminds us that it was never just a national story, but a part of a worldwide demand for human dignity. As the 1980s and 90s unfolded, new challenges emerged. The crack cocaine epidemic ravaged Black communities, exacerbating cycles of poverty and incarceration. Police violence continued to claim lives, fueling distrust between law enforcement and communities of color. Yet activism also adapted to these challenges. Grassroots organizations fought for criminal justice reform, education equity, and economic opportunity. Churches, community centers, and nonprofit groups carried forward the legacy of service and advocacy. The memory of Martin Luther King became a touchstone for these efforts, though often in contested ways. Each January, his words were celebrated, his image invoked by politicians across the spectrum. But some activists warned that this sanitized version of King ignored his more radical critiques of capitalism, militarism, and systemic inequality. To honor his legacy fully, they argued, was to continue the hard, uncomfortable work of challenging injustice in all its forms. By the dawn of the 21st century, the civil rights movement was both a history lesson and a living force. Young people studied the sit-ins and marches in classrooms, while new movements like Black Lives Matter drew from their strategies. Technology gave activists new tools. Social media replaced leaflets, viral videos replaced television broadcasts, but the essential dynamic remained the same: ordinary people organizing to demand extraordinary change. The American civil rights movement reminds us that progress is not linear. It is not a steady climb toward justice, but a series of advances, setbacks, victories, and defeats. For every law passed, there were loopholes exploited. For every leader celebrated, there were countless foot soldiers forgotten. For every speech remembered, there were daily acts of courage that never made the news. Yet together,
the American civil rights movement was not only a battle fought in streets, courts, and churches. It was also a battle of memory, of who gets to define the meaning of America. History itself became a weapon, and activists understood that reclaiming the story of African Americans was essential to building pride, unity, and resilience. Textbooks in the mid-20th century often either ignored Black history or reduced it to a handful of figures. The achievements of Black scientists, artists, inventors, and leaders were erased or diminished. To combat this, activists like Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history, had long pushed for the teaching of African American contributions. His creation of Negro History Week in 1926, which later evolved into Black History Month, was one way of countering historical erasure. By the time the civil rights movement surged in the 1950s and 60s, the demand to teach Black history in schools had become a crucial part of the struggle. Education was not just about knowledge, it was about identity and liberation. Music also became a profound expression of the movement. Spirituals, gospel songs, and freedom anthems gave courage to marchers and inspired solidarity. Songs like We Shall Overcome, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, and This Little Light of Mine were not just melodies, but declarations of defiance. Singing together helped activists endure jail cells, beatings, and long marches. The music carried the memory of slavery and the promise of freedom, binding generations in shared purpose. The role of young people in the movement is especially striking. Teenagers and college students often stood on the front lines, testing segregation laws, challenging police, and risking expulsion from schools or worse. The Children's Crusade in Birmingham in 1963 saw thousands of students, some as young as 6, leave their classrooms to march for freedom. Many were arrested, their small bodies filling jail cells. The images of children being blasted with fire hoses and attacked by dogs shocked the world and underscored the brutality of segregation. Their bravery demonstrated that the movement was not simply led from the top down. It was sustained by ordinary people of all ages willing to take extraordinary risks. The civil rights movement also forced the United States to confront its Constitution and the gap between its ideals and its reality. The Declaration of Independence spoke of liberty and equality, yet for centuries, those words had been denied to millions. The 14th and 15th Amendments promised equal protection and voting rights, but Jim Crow made a mockery of those guarantees. Civil rights activists wielded these founding documents not as distant relics, but as living promises. By demanding that America live up to its own words, they revealed the Constitution not as static, but as a tool for justice. Religion was another thread woven tightly into the movement's fabric. Black churches were more than places of worship. They were training grounds for leadership, centers for strategy, and sanctuaries of hope. Pastors, deacons, and congregants turned faith into fuel for activism. The language of the Bible gave the movement its poetry, its vision of a promised land beyond the wilderness of oppression. But religion was not confined to Christianity alone. Jewish rabbis marched with King in Selma, Muslim leaders spoke out against injustice, and interfaith solidarity showed that civil rights was a moral issue transcending doctrine. Meanwhile, the opposition to civil rights was fierce, determined, and often violent. Segregationists argued that change was happening too fast, that outside agitators were stirring up trouble, that traditions were being destroyed. Governors like George Wallace of Alabama stood defiantly in schoolhouse doors, declaring segregation forever. Citizens' councils used economic intimidation to punish Black families, denying loans, firing employees, evicting tenants if they dared to challenge the system. White supremacist groups bombed churches, murdered activists, and terrorized communities. The price of resistance was high, yet the movement pressed forward. One cannot overlook the role of the federal government. At times, Washington dragged its feet, worried of alienating Southern voters. At other times, under pressure, it acted decisively. President Eisenhower sent troops to enforce school integration in Little Rock. President Kennedy, though initially cautious, eventually called civil rights a moral issue and proposed sweeping legislation. President Johnson, despite being a Southerner, championed the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, using his political skill to push them through Congress. Federal courts issued rulings that chipped away at segregation, though enforcement was always a struggle. Yet even as federal laws changed, local realities often did not. In many counties, sheriffs and police simply ignored court orders. Judges looked the other way. School boards stalled. Resistance to integration stretched on for years, revealing that racism was not just about laws, but about deeply ingrained attitudes. The media, too, shaped the story. Television, still relatively new in the 1960s, brought the images of the movement into American homes. For the first time, Northern audiences could see with their own eyes the beatings, the marches, the courage of children. This visual storytelling galvanized public opinion in ways that speeches alone could not. Newspapers also played a role, though often divided along regional lines. Northern papers tended to highlight the injustice of segregation, while many Southern papers defended the status quo. Activists skillfully used media coverage to expose hypocrisy and win allies.
As the years went on, the civil rights movement broadened its scope. Activists began addressing issues of poverty, labor rights, and healthcare. King's final campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, aimed to unite poor people of all races in demanding economic justice. He understood that racism and poverty were intertwined, that true equality could not exist without dismantling economic exploitation. Though his assassination cut the campaign short, its vision foreshadowed later movements linking racial justice to broader struggles against inequality. In examining the legacy of the civil rights movement, it is also important to acknowledge the psychological toll it took. Activists lived under constant threat of arrest, of beatings, of bombs, of death. Families were torn apart by fear. Children grew up with the trauma of violence. Yet the resilience of these communities was astonishing. Out of suffering came solidarity. Out of despair came determination. The movement was not powered by the absence of hardship, but by the refusal to surrender to it. By the time America entered the late 20th century, the civil rights movement had transformed the nation's laws, its politics, and its conscience. But it had also left unfinished business. Schools remained segregated by neighborhood and income. The wealth gap between Black and white families persisted. Discrimination in employment and housing continued in subtle but devastating ways. The dream had been spoken, the reality lagged far behind. Nevertheless, the movement planted seeds that continue to grow. Black mayors, congresspeople, and eventually a president could trace their paths back to the doors opened by the marches of the 1960s. Affirmative action created opportunities for education and employment that had once been closed. Black studies programs in universities gave intellectual grounding to a history too long denied. Civil rights museums, memorials, and holidays kept the memory alive for new generations. The civil rights movement also left behind a blueprint for activism. Its strategies, boycotts, marches, sit-ins, court cases, coalition building, remain models for social justice movements today. Environmental justice campaigns, women's rights organizations, immigrant rights activists, and LGBTQ groups have all drawn inspiration from the methods pioneered in Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma, and beyond. The lesson is clear. When ordinary people organize collectively, they can shake even the most entrenched systems of power. As we reflect on this history, we must remember that the civil rights movement was never inevitable. It was the product of choice, courage, and persistence. At any point, fear could have silenced voices, division could have derailed unity, violence could have crushed resistance. But through determination, the movement endured. It shows us that progress is possible, but only when people are willing to risk comfort for justice and silence for truth. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the movement is its insistence on human dignity. In a world where laws, customs, and even science had been twisted to declare Black people inferior, the civil rights movement stood a resounding declaration: we are human, we are equal, we are free. That declaration echoes still, not just in America, but wherever people demand recognition of their worth. The civil rights movement was not perfect. It had flaws, divisions, and shortcomings. It sometimes struggled to include women fully, or to address class and economic inequality in sustained ways. Its victories were sometimes more symbolic than substantive. Yet to judge it only by its imperfections is to miss its miracle, the transformation of a nation's moral landscape in the span of a single generation. The echoes of this struggle continue into the present. When protesters chant "No justice, no peace," or "Black Lives Matter," they are carrying forward the same cry for humanity that resounded in Montgomery. The American civil rights movement stands as a monumental story of ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges, and it remains one of the most influential movements in modern history. Its power lay not only in its leaders or its victories, but in the collective determination of men, women, and children who refused to accept second-class citizenship any longer. Their actions altered the laws of the land, reshaped the nation's identity, and inspired global struggles for freedom.
But to truly understand its enduring relevance, we must explore the deeper meanings and ongoing struggles that emerged from its legacy. One of the key lessons of the movement is the power of persistence. Change did not come overnight. It came after years, indeed centuries, of resistance. For every march that captured the world's attention, there were countless meetings in church basements, late-night strategy sessions, and hours spent knocking on doors in hostile neighborhoods. Progress was built through daily labor, often invisible, often thankless, but always essential. This persistence teaches us that social change is rarely sudden. It is forged through steady, sustained effort. Another lesson is the importance of moral courage. Activists in the civil rights movement knew the dangers they faced. They saw what happened to Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy brutally murdered in Mississippi in 1955. They knew about the bombings of homes and churches, the lynchings that scarred communities, the police who beat marchers with impunity. Yet they chose to act anyway. Courage, as the movement showed, is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. This kind of courage inspires people even today, reminding us that injustice can only be confronted when we choose principle over comfort. The civil rights movement also highlighted the power of unity across differences. Though African Americans led the struggle, allies from diverse backgrounds played crucial roles. Clergy from Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant traditions marched together in Selma. White students from northern universities risked their lives in Freedom Summer. Latino and Asian activists drew inspiration and solidarity from the movement's victories. This unity was never perfect, and tensions often arose, but the coalition proved that justice is strongest when it is inclusive. Yet the story of civil rights is also one of unfinished business. While the movement dismantled legal segregation, it could not erase the legacy of centuries of inequality. The wealth gap between Black and white families remains vast. Schools, though technically desegregated, are still deeply divided by race and class. Mass incarceration disproportionately affects African Americans, echoing past systems of racial control. Police violence continues to spark protests, much as it did decades ago. These realities remind us that the struggle is ongoing, that victories of the past are foundations, not endpoints. The modern resonance of the civil rights movement can be seen in the rise of Black Lives Matter. Sparked by the killings of unarmed African Americans, the movement mobilized millions worldwide to protest systemic racism and demand accountability. Like the earlier movement, Black Lives Matter relies on grassroots organizing, mass demonstrations, and the moral force of ordinary voices demanding justice. It shows that the civil rights movement strategies remain relevant, and its unfinished work still calls us forward. Beyond America, the legacy of the movement continues to inspire global struggles. Activists fighting apartheid in South Africa drew strength from King's speeches and the example of nonviolent resistance. Human rights defenders in Latin America, Asia, and Europe have cited the civil rights movement as a model. Its lessons about persistence, courage, and coalition building are universal. Wherever people demand dignity, the echoes of Selma, Montgomery, and Washington can be heard. It is also important to reflect on the cultural transformations sparked by the movement. The visibility of African American art, literature, and music surged in its wake. From the writings of James Baldwin and Maya Angelou to the voices of Aretha Franklin and Sam Cooke, culture became a vehicle for expressing both the pain of oppression and the joy of resilience. Today, hip-hop, film, and literature continue to carry forward the tradition of using art as a tool for justice. This cultural power, rooted in the movement, reshaped how America sees itself and how the world sees America. The civil rights movement also changed the very language of democracy. Phrases like "I have a dream" or "we shall overcome" have entered the global lexicon, symbols of hope and determination. These words remind us that democracy is not static. It must be claimed and reclaimed by each generation. The language of the movement continues to inspire, whether spoken in classrooms, protests, or halls of power.
But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the civil rights movement is the reminder that history is not made by distant heroes, but by ordinary people. Rosa Parks was a seamstress. Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper. John Lewis was a young student. Their courage and determination show that leadership can emerge from anywhere, that every person has the capacity to shape history. This democratization of leadership is itself a profound lesson. Change belongs to all of us. As we step back and consider the broader arc of the movement, we see both triumph and tragedy. Triumph in the victories achieved, laws passed, barriers broken, voices amplified. Tragedy in the lives lost, the promises deferred, the inequalities that persist. But even in tragedy, the movement offers hope because it demonstrates that progress, however imperfect, is possible when people refuse to surrender to despair. Today, when we face challenges of racism, inequality, and division, the civil rights movement speaks across time. It tells us that progress requires sacrifice, that justice demands courage, and that hope must be kept alive even in the darkest moments. It challenges us not to simply admire the past, but to act in the present. The question is not whether the civil rights movement succeeded or failed, it is whether we will continue its work. So as we close this journey through the American civil rights movement, let us remember the voices that sang in the streets, the marchers who faced batons and bullets, the leaders who dreamed of freedom, and the countless unnamed who made history through quiet acts of resistance. Their story is not just America's story, it is a human story, a testament to the enduring struggle for dignity and equality. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.